All right, welcome. So today we are conducting a session for University College, and we have two presenters. All right, my name is Ben Johnson. So today, and I'm associate professor in and associate chair in the Department of Student Leadership and Success Studies. Our panelists today are Laurie Toro and KayKay Spate. I'll just introduce both of them, and they'll each present for a few minutes, and then we will open it up for questions. So we'll start with that approach. First, I'll just briefly introduce Laurie and KayKay, and they'll probably elaborate a little bit on themselves as well. But Laurie, she has a bachelor's in English with an emphasis in literary analysis. She has a Master's of Arts in Community Leadership also, and she recently finished a thesis on cultural assemblage, the complex cultural and identity navigation of multicultural youth. She's currently the peer tutoring coordinator in academic tutoring and adjunct faculty member and facilitator for UVU Foundations of Inclusion, Race, and Ethnicity workshop. She's also a facilitator for OTLs, or the Office of Teaching and Learning's Global and Intercultural Workshop on Culturally Relevant Pedagogies. Our second panelist is KayKay Spate. She has a bachelor's in psychology from Southern Utah University, and she's currently working on her master's in education with an emphasis on higher education leadership here at UVU. She's also the lead facilitator for the UVU Foundations of Inclusion, Race, and Ethnicity workshop. And I think she may want to comment. She got a new position that she also got a comment that she may want to comment on as well. So maybe I'll let you decide on if you want to talk about that, KayKay. So thanks to our panelists, and we're going to start with Laurie. So feel free to go ahead and start with your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. So as Ben mentioned, or spoke a little bit to my credentials already, but I do feel like it's important to share just a little bit about my personal positionality with this particular topic. First and foremost, I use the she, her pronouns. I am a white woman. I was raised primarily in California, although I've spent a significant amount of time here in Utah. I'm the mother of two children, as you can see here in this photo. And my master's research was stemmed from a really personal place, as most research does, really. My children are multicultural, and although they're mixed in culture and heritage, the general public readily accepts my children as white, in spite of the fact that both of them identify far more with their Venezuelan roots than they do with their white Irish American heritage, which often causes them to feel like they're kind of on the outside of their culture or their ethnic groups, both having experienced colorism, which is skin color-based discrimination, outside and even inside their Latino community, being teased for their accent or not being fluent enough in Spanish. They frequently have to provide proof or evidence of belonging to their ethnic group. And so they're constantly engaging with or trying to make meaning of the invisible boundaries around them. So that is actually what led to my research. And ultimately, the purpose of my research was to provide more insight into the experiences and feelings that multicultural students go through when it comes to identity creation and cultural navigation. So my research helped me make some important connections regarding culture. I started with assemblage theory, which holds that everything is a result of a process of intersections and connections. And this helped me to better understand the practice of code meshing, which is something that I'll speak a little bit more to in just a moment, before I landed on or at the unequivocal and most significant finding in my research, which was the need for culturally sustaining pedagogies. So before I dive into culturally sustaining pedagogies, I think it's important to introduce and define a couple of really important concepts. The first of which being code switching. Many of you are probably already familiar with or have heard of before. The scholarship that I read in preparation for my research often referenced code switching as a coping mechanism or a communication tool for multicultural students. Linguists define code switching as the simple act of switching between two languages. However, code switching is much more complicated than that. In fact, the arguments used to support code switching are startlingly and undeniably similar to those that are used to support racial separation. Historically, code switching has not only been an acceptable but expected practice among multicultural students. And what's conspicuously left out of most definitions of code switching is how it mainly applies and affects persons or communities of color. So code switching is not only an example of a deficiency-based approach to viewing education and culture, but it also serves as an assimilative practice. The idea behind code switching is that standard English should be taught and used in the correct context, which is often referred to as helping students transition from home grammar to school grammar or to grammar used in the classroom. And what that suggests is that the language practices used at home are not good enough for the language practices in other settings like school. So one of the biggest problems with code switching is that it's not just a linguistic practice, but a cultural one as well. The practice of code switching merely perpetuates the notion that one culture is superior over another. Additionally, it restricts how expressive multicultural students can be by not allowing them to express their whole self. And in today's increasingly multicultural and multi-ethnic society, the idea of requiring multicultural students to make a hard shift between cultures as they move through life's conversations is really antiquated, and frankly, an intolerant ideology. But thankfully, a shift is being made towards a more holistic approach to language performance, which is the concept of code meshing. So code meshing, or first code switching, is an assimilative practice that only works in one direction, and that's towards the dominant group or culture. Code meshing is the blending together of diverse cultures, languages, and sources in really strategic ways. So this essentially means that anyone with a multicultural background is aware of arbitrary cultural boundaries and still chooses to mesh their multiple literacies in ways that are meaningful to them. So whether it's their language, their culture, school, politics, family, or their friend spheres, whatever. As opposed to segregating the linguistic practices of multicultural students, the advancement of code meshing specifically connotes that the society honors the histories, the stories, the experiences, and the identities of multicultural students, as opposed to forcing them to conform to dominant culture's way of talking and acting and thinking. So then, what is culturally sustaining pedagogy? Well, when I asked the participants of my research how they've been educated in the Utah K-12 system about their respective cultures or cultures beyond the dominant, they really struggled to come up with examples, save in geography where culture was limited to a specific location, or when learning about the different settlers throughout US history. Sustaining culture is the heart and soul of educational justice, because culture is the heart and soul of what it means to be human. So the approach of culturally sustaining pedagogy is a teaching style that perpetuates and fosters linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as a part of schooling for positive social transformation, and using fundamentally humanizing approaches that stand in contrast to the embedded deficit lenses of the racial contract that otherwise structure schooling and education. So we've already discussed some of the ethical connections by touching on code switching and code meshing. Additionally, it's important to think about pedagogical approaches to education. For students who may or may not understand exactly what pedagogy is, basically curriculum is what's being taught and pedagogy is how. So there's a significant number of pedagogical methods that support the deficit or difference approach as defined on this slide. Multicultural students, however, only stand to benefit from more educators practicing culturally sustaining pedagogies, particularly since the educational philosophy of CSP views dynamic cultural dexterity as a necessary good and sees the outcomes of learning as additive rather than subtractive, as remaining whole rather than being framed as broken, and as critically enriching strengths rather than replacing deficits. So culturally sustaining pedagogy as an educational practice specifically pushes back against the assimilative practice of code switching, which was specifically created to replace deficits. The Utah K-12 system, educational system, along with higher ed here in Utah, would benefit from this pedagogical approach that raises questions about the educational system's role in changing societies and whether they're working to sustain or eradicate cultural practices, particularly for when it comes to communities of color. Now, the question that I get asked the most is, what does this look like in the classroom? Well, there are several different things that can happen in a classroom setting and how to kind of employ this particular pedagogy. Consistently and meaningfully centering your students' languages, literacies, and cultural ways of being. One of the easiest ways to do that is to seek out non-traditional texts. So, and also texts that are written by non-traditional folks. So go beyond whatever the canon text is for your particular field, incorporating videos, student writings, poetry, blogs, memes, podcasts, all of that helps. If you explore and or mesh code meshing languages yourself, as opposed to requiring only the standard English in the classroom, explore and model, support code meshing and the blending of language varieties. This approach actually helps students note the complex power dynamics surrounding language use. Also, encourage students to explore alternative cultural affiliations. This practice helps students and teachers, educators, understand the complexity of culture and the multiple affiliations of every student. So that's it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions after KayKay.
Awesome. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Did I get it? Yay. Alrighty. Well, hi, folks. Like Ben introduced, my name is KayKay. And just kind of to establish where I'm speaking from, for those watching that don't know me, I identify as a mixed chick. I'm mixed Black and white. I use she, her pronouns. I was born and raised in Fairbanks, Alaska, but moved to Utah in 2009 to go to Southern Utah University and get my bachelor's in psychology. And I'm currently working towards my master's of education with an emphasis in higher education leadership. And like Ben said, I do have a new position on campus. I am officially the graduate assistant for the Dean of Students and Student Life. Super exciting, doing some awesome things there. Again, just speaking to my own positionality, it kind of all started back with my psychology degree. I've always been really interested in why people do what they do and just studying behavior in general. After spending some time in Utah, it kind of evolved into a curiosity surrounding personal experiences due to my race or my perceived race in this community. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Currently, I am working on my final graduate project, which is based off of intergroup dialogue around race and ethnicity. Intergroup dialogue, just to define that for you folks, is an evidence-based form of dialogue for educational engagement. Over the past few years, it's really evolved into educational practices used to address social justice issues in education and in community settings. It will involve UVU staff and faculty. There will be 4 sessions over 4 months, which will include activities, little reading, self-exploration work, There will be a pre and post survey to evaluate any progress, including the statements, the examples from the assessment on the side there, just different things we'll be looking for, that I'll be looking for. Kind of an increase in places of I'm aware of my social identities, I understand which of my identities give me privilege or do not, or I know how to use conflict to deepen my understanding across intersections of identity, namely race and ethnicity will be my focus, and I know how to respond when making a mistake. So through reflection and dialogue, participants really move towards praxis or action in order to create a more just society within our community of UVU. I guess kind of important, at least to me, is why I'm interested in this. So after looking into intergroup dialogue as a program and seeing the results, which again, the studies showed that participants increased their understanding of race, gender, and income inequality. They increased their intergroup empathy and motivation to connect with members of other groups. But even more importantly to me was that further studies over a few years showed that these gains persisted for many years after participants engaged in these dialogues and went through the program. So all that being said, I was kind of interested if the same positive progress could be made within the really unique context of UVU in the middle of Utah County. Just to make really quick connection for y'all, right? So why we're here, what does this have to do with ethics? Just my quick Google search here, the definition of ethics, system of moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the concepts of right and wrong. Oops, I think I skipped ahead for y'all. Sorry about that. So keeping this definition in mind, to me, it was like, my thought was, how could it be possible that the themes of race and ethnicity are at all unrelated to ethics in the classroom? The equitable treatment of individuals, at least in my personal thinking, again, just speaking from my experience and my positionality and my thinking, this is directly influenced by a person or a space's ethics. I believe engaging in these intergroup dialogues and learning the tools to navigate them successfully across intersections of identity really contribute to a more ethical classroom and a more ethical society as a whole. And there are my sources, and I will also take questions if any folks have them.
Thank you. Yes. So what questions do you have? We're monitoring. I'm monitoring, mostly me. I'm monitoring the chat here on the YouTube live channel. So feel free to throw your questions into the chat feature there, and I know Laurie and KayKay will be happy to answer. So while the questions are coming in, I thought maybe you two could maybe ask each other some questions and maybe make some brief comparisons of your research. How are they connected or linked? And you work together in different contexts, so maybe you could kind of share a little bit.
Yeah, KayKay, do you want to speak to that? Do you want me to speak to that?
Go for it. I'll build off whatever you say.
Well, KayKay and I work together with the FOI, the Foundation for Inclusion, right? So KayKay actually invited me to be a facilitator for that. For both of us, I think that this work is, diversity and inclusion work is really important, and for a lot of reasons, but most of which stem from really personal places, right? But I think that, yeah, the type of research that I did in my master's program, and then the type of work that KayKay is doing now actually overlaps a great deal, mostly because we're talking still about similar demographics or background with the students, right? And then obviously what we're trying to promote or put forward, obviously there was a lot of similarities with those things, a little bit of a different approach, but similar all the same.
Yeah, I would just largely agree with pretty much everything Laurie just said, and just building off of that and into the connections with our work, although our populations were quite a bit different. Laurie working with high school students, and then I'm moving into staff and faculty members at an institution of higher education. the overlap in that work is that we are both really trying to disrupt systems of disadvantaged thinking, right? Whether it be within language, like Laurie was talking about with code meshing and code switching, to my work with intergroup dialogue and really disrupting those majority narratives that are out there, again, in order to create a more just or ethical space for everyone.
Thank you. We have a few questions for you. The first one is, what's been your favorite thing teaching others about your specific research? So sort of a very general question, but a specific question. What's been your favorite thing about teaching others about your specific research? So maybe let's start with Laurie and then go to KayKay.
That's an interesting question. I think that, and I don't know what KayKay or even Ben, what you think when you did all of your research, but when you're researching something and it's really kind of personal, you're like, why? I mean, I hope that this makes a difference someday. I hope somebody else finds this interesting too. And so that's probably one of the most rewarding aspects for me, or one of the things that's been most interesting in sharing my research, is that people are genuinely interested. And it's been really, it's been super rewarding to do something that was so deeply personal and then watch kind of this trickle effect of how it's actually making changes happening because of it. So that's super exciting for me.
I'm going to answer really similarly to Laurie in the fact of just when introducing the work that I'm doing to folks, and as I've been developing and talking to different folks about it, just seeing the interest that people have. I think it's easy to say when introducing a lot of these themes, it can kind of be confronted with a lot of resistance or defensiveness, but just seeing so many folks open to even starting these discussions or hearing out these different points has been the most interesting part for me. And then waiting to go through my workshops. And then the most interesting point, we'll see if there's been any changes just on our campus in general.
Yeah, what impact might be made, right? If there's a difference that's being made. Again, some more questions, great questions coming through. Could you comment on what are components of different social identities? So for example, what are the different social identities, in other words?
Who's that for, Ben?
Either one of you can take that one.
KayKay, you want to go?
Yeah, I'll start and you fill in any blanks if I miss anything. So at least the way in my work through my project, I work with social identities. That ranges from everything: race and ethnicity, socioeconomic class, sexual identity, gender expression, gender identity, just really across the board, different ways we kind of like categorize and class in society that is considered a social identity.
Yep, perfect. And religion.
Okay.
How did I forget that one? Okay, thank you.
Here's another question. Obviously, Utah County is not the most diverse place. However, I've noticed that UVU seems to have a diverse student body. In your experience, how have teachers and the faculty responded with code meshing? So maybe this is more for you, Laurie.
Yeah, so that's a super interesting question. I presented at a conference here at UVU about a year ago that had some professors in the room. They weren't exactly thrilled with the idea of code meshing. I'm not going to lie. I do think that there are aspects of culturally sustaining pedagogy and even this idea of code meshing that feel kind of radical to a lot of faculty members. It kind of bucks against maybe what they learned all throughout their educational career and their master's and PhD programs. And I think that there's an element of, I had to learn this way, so everybody else needs to learn this way as well. So I think that there's a general kind of, even if it's a slow movement towards, excuse me, accepting code meshing or allowing that in the spaces, or even kind of understanding what that is or how to make space for that in your classroom, I think that there is a slow roll with that, which I'm hopeful. I mean, I'd like for it to speed up, but and it's going to be a little bit different from professor to professor and field to field, right? In the field of linguistics or in the field of like literature and literacies seems to be a little bit faster. Everybody else is slowly, picking up the pace though too.
KayKay, did you want to comment or move on?
Oh, move on.
Okay. Okay, so we've got some questions that are sort of similar, but I'm going to go in order for now. So feel free if you want to move on, we can get to some other questions. But this question of what has been the biggest challenge or hurdle that you've faced when advocating for this type of classroom engagement or staff engagement. So you kind of talked about it a little bit, but you want to elaborate, maybe each of you. And also there's a question a little bit later talked about the next one actually, do you think there are issues specific to Utah or Utah County that really require you to use a different approach to teaching foundations of inclusion? So I'll ask both of those and maybe I'll start with KayKay and then move to Laurie.
Absolutely. So biggest hurdle, gosh, and this applies to my grad work as well as my work with race and ethnicity FOI, is honestly just getting people to the table. I think that is the hardest part, right? Is just getting people to want to engage in these conversations and in these spaces, whether that be regarding, like I said, my grad project, just getting people to want to do that kind of self-exploration and really opt into that really vulnerable space. And same with the FOIs. Can you say the second question for me?
Yeah, so with the FOI, are there Utah specific or Utah County specific approaches that make it challenging for using a different approach to teaching the FOI?
I don't know if I would personally say there's a heavy influence of Utah or Utah County specific influence, and that I would say I think it's just a general kind of, like I said earlier, resistance and defensiveness when anybody's challenging any sort of long-held beliefs, things that really have made you up until this point, right? Things that you held true. There's always going to be resistance challenging those, and some spaces are harder than others, but I wouldn't say it's directly related to our context specifically. There's a ton of factors that go into that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm with KayKay on that. And I think that as far as hurdles are concerned, and particularly in Utah or specifically in Utah County, yeah, it is the resistance or just folks having a hard time kind of acknowledging some of the privilege that they're sitting with, right? And then recognizing or learning how to kind of step outside of that to accept something else that is different from what their norm is.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the next questions is what's the biggest complaint, right, you receive if you get pushback from the community? But you kind of touched on that, I think. Feel free to add to it if you want. I'll also move on to the next question. In your opinion, so this is for both of you again, how do these principles of interdiversity affect the way we make political and government decisions as white citizens in the United States, for example?
So in my master's program, we actually had a policy class where we talk a lot about this, right? So somebody mentioned before that, yeah, Utah in and of itself, not terribly diverse, right? But even here at UVU, we see a more diverse kind of population of students that come here. I think one of the bigger problems is, and KayKay spoke to this before, right? Getting people to the table. So when you're making any kind of decisions that are about, policy related, so whether that's politics on a global or bigger scale, or just even politics within an individual department, If voices aren't being heard or represented, then of course you're just going to stick to whatever the dominant narrative is, whatever is the dominant voice in the room. And so if it's a bunch of white folks, then we're not going to hear any of the voices or be able to make policies that really are going to encourage just the voices or hearing the voices of these other areas, right? So even in one of the slides that I showed with culturally sustaining pedagogies, they actually say part of what we should be doing as educators is going out into the community and finding exactly what the needs are of a specific community. It's really not up to me to decide what you need, right? So we should be allowing the community to come to us and saying, hey, we need this, so can we be partners in this together? But more often than not, that's not happening, particularly when we're talking about policy making.
I'm going to go ahead and say I agree with everything Laurie said, but I will probably refrain from speaking too much on that point because although I am half white, not exactly my reality and not ever been in that high of like an administrative role. So I probably don't have the greatest insight on policy and government type things from a white perspective.
Thank you. So one of the next questions is, how do you determine the difference, the need for social reform versus personal reform?
Well, I don't think you can have social reform if you don't have personal reform. So that's where it starts. It starts with you and then it goes out, right? So start here and then move outwards. It has to be you first.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my grad project, in the last module of the workshops, we work on allyhood. And that's one of the first things is just to really identify your spheres of influence, right? But the biggest circle in the middle is you yourself. And that's where it all starts. But yeah, that absolutely builds out, right?
This is all connected to the next question. Is there, do you think the politics of today, I mean, I'm thinking about the debate last night too, have divided the racial community on campus? So thinking broader than just last night, of course, but do you think the politics of today have divided the racial community on campus?
I'm not a member of the racial community on campus, so I don't really feel equipped to answer that question. I certainly don't want to speak on their behalf.
And I will answer sort of the same way. Obviously, I don't represent any sort of whole racial group. I only can represent myself as one mixed person on campus. I would say for me personally, it has not increased it as much as it's made it more publicized. Easy access to information, easy access to different viewpoints and stuff, social media, the way we get news now. I'd say that's kind of just heightened an alarm that's already been going off for a lot of us.
And this question's for Laurie, is there a difference between code meshing for language and culture?
I would say no. I think that historically or traditionally we hear about it more exclusively when it's applied to language, but it happens with culture as well, because culture kind of dictates just the way that we act, right? So whatever societal norms are, that's kind of predicated, or our culture reflects that, right? So if I'm being forced to assimilate for some reason, then yeah, obviously my cultural practices, whatever they had been, are going to change based off of whatever is right now, or whatever the dominant culture is, I guess.
This question's for KayKay. I'm thinking based on your description of positionality and what has your experience been living in Utah as a mixed individual?
Yeah, it again just kind of awareness of my own identity, at least racially, ethnically, was heightened once I moved here. Growing up in Alaska, again, it's not a hugely diverse place, not in the city that I was in. But me being mixed race was more just kind of a matter of fact and not so much of a a who you are kind of thing. And who you are, I'm talking about any sort of assumptions and biases applied to that when folks see me. Moving to Utah and going through my undergrad and such in Cedar City, if anybody is familiar with Cedar City, very rural, very, very small town. Absolutely loved every second of it, but it was interesting to kind of be seen as my racial, my ethnic background. And again, whatever assumptions and biases were applied with that. And then also being mixed race, kind of being like racially ambiguous here. Different assumptions came. So here I get asked a lot if I'm Polynesian. I lived in California for a little bit, and there I was asked a lot if I was Latina. It's as I spent more time here in Utah, it's just interesting. I noticed a lot of different behaviors, situations, the way conversations might change if I was in the room or not. That kind of just like snapped me to like, oh, this my identity does actually mean something, at least my racial identity here. And I just kind of wanted to see what that was. Like, what does that mean?
Thank you. Here's I think a question that's looking for some suggestions. Speaking for us broader, maybe the homogenous community, or white population perhaps, and how can I personally understand my privilege better and help create a more inclusive and understanding environment at school?
Laurie, I'm gonna let you go, girl.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of what we spoke about earlier, right? Like there's an awful lot of self-reflection that has to be done first and foremost, right? You have to start there. But there are a lot of books, there are movies, there are podcasts, there are a lot of things, ways for you to engage and learn more about what privileges you hold and how that affects, you know, any community of color or any community that differs from you around you. And what's important to do is critically engage with those texts, right? So if it's a movie or if it's a podcast or a book or something, then it's really reflecting back on that and thinking, what was different about their experience, and would I ever feel that same way if I were in that situation, right? And if the answer is no, then that's a direct reflection of privilege, right? So then it's thinking about just different things you say or do on a daily basis. You know, I mean, so KayKay was just speaking about people asking her what her ethnicity is or her origins or whatever, you know, being cognizant of things like that. Those oftentimes are interpreted as microaggressions. We want to be really careful of those kinds of things. But you have to start somewhere. So you could do a quick Google search and find a lot of different options, and everybody's different. We all come to the table in different spaces. It's a continuum, right? So we're all constantly learning. Nobody's perfect. I'm certainly not perfect when it comes to any diversity and inclusion work. I'm constantly learning myself and making mistakes. I will say that if somebody corrects you from one of these other communities, like, thank them. Thank them for offering the correction, and take that correction and move forward in a positive way.
This is a related question. Do you think that white privilege is a real thing, and does it heavily influence the racial inequality in America?
Yes.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Is it, you know, does white privilege really happen? Is it you know, something fabricated to, you know, or is it a real phenomenon? And so I mean, we could get into the nuance of the language, right? But it's clear there are, based on, you know, experiences of others and perceptions of friends and the research that there is this, I would argue, this sense of white privilege, and being aware of that is key, just like what Laurie and KayKay have been talking about. And so being reflective on how we act and how we think, and recognizing, maybe I have a privilege in this context that maybe someone, maybe a person of color or would not, right? And so being aware of that, I think is a key. You guys want to comment on that anymore?
I will say, for if there's anyone kind of questioning that as a concept, coming from somebody who does identify as BIPOC, right? Black or Indigenous person of color, I am on the lighter side. I am extremely fair-skinned for being mixed. So I recognize there is absolute privilege in that. I have never had any sort of apprehensions or fears when it comes to being pulled over. In fact, I've scared many of my family members, because as I'm being pulled over, I'm digging around for stuff. I'm not sitting, it's like my seatbelt's already off. Like, I have zero fears around that. I don't fear walking through a neighborhood and being stopped to ask why I'm there. So although like there are barriers that I do have to kind of confront, there's a lot of privilege in having lighter skin, and I just want to put that out there for folks kind of questioning that. That I also, like, a lot of us have to recognize our privileges in that, and it's not just a white folks are bad, like you're doing all these terrible things. Like, we all have places we need to recognize our privilege.
Thank you. So there's a kind of a discussion going on. I'm going to kind of sift through some of these, but the question that emerges for me is, how do you feel about, for example, Asian students' admissions at Harvard being capped, for example? Kind of a specific question, but I think maybe there's larger implications.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know a whole lot about that, other than like headlines and things, right? I don't know. Some of these things are really very difficult to speak to. And again, it comes back to even one of the questions that was asked before about, policies, how policies are written and made, right? So I don't know what the individual policies of a particular university are, or the reasons behind why they did that, who was at the table, who engaged in that conversation, what were the reasonings behind why they made those choices. There's so many things that just I personally can't speak to. With that, So I mean, I would hope that they were well intended, but I don't know that either. So
yeah, I'd say this is a great place for all folks in this space right now, us presenting and those watching, to kind of recognize these are the kind of things, like, this is where you can take initiative and do the research, right? Like, why get as much information you can, like Laurie was saying, why these policies were made, who was at the table making the decisions, are there any actual state, federal laws that these are based around that makes it either okay or not okay, different things like that. And then, at least, although we're not in the room making these decisions with these folks, we have a better knowledge base if we ever kind of come to these circumstances in our own lives.
So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to allow time for you to have some closing comments about anything you think you would hope would have come up, or that we ought to address based on reflecting on the questions. For example, there's one question that I'll ask the question and let Laurie start, and then KayKay finish. Okay, with closing comments. So the question is, what about a subject that culture isn't part of the curriculum, like math? There isn't Black math or white math. So how would these things apply to something like a math class?
yeah, that's an interesting question. And I mean, regardless of whether or not, we're talking about numbers or something, culture is still present. Culture is 100% still present in the classroom. And when we're talking about culture or languages or histories or knowledges, the way that people learn, that's also something that you totally see in the classroom, right? So I remember I took math here on campus with Clay Brown, freaking love Clay Brown. But I remember sitting in a class one day and working on a math problem, and up on the board was showing us how to work out this math problem. But then he was like, but here's something, you can also do it like this and then solve it another way. He's like, but also you can solve it like this and then solve it another way. And I think that just speaks to or goes to show that we have ways of learning, whether that's like that comes, down from our grandparents or, particularly with like Indigenous communities, right? When we're talking about funds of knowledge and the ways that we learn, what we're trying to advocate for really is that there's a space for recognizing that there's meaning and importance behind the way that people learn and how those histories and knowledges are brought into the classroom. And that is all a part of culture. And then accepting and making space for that, right? So allowing a student to say in a math classroom, oh, you're teaching it to me like this, but I learned it like this, still works, still getting the right answer. So I'm just going to keep doing it like this and this is going to be okay, right? So I think that that's where this kind of comes into play.
I'll just add a little tidbit to that. I'm gonna say folks could really reach out. There are many experts across campus for this particular subject. Laurie knows a ton, and then also Trevor Warburton. He's one of our facilitators for race and ethnicity faculty in the School of Ed. So this is also one of his specialties, and I'm sure he could tell you a ton.
Great, thank you. Any closing thoughts or comments?
I just want to say that this has been really great. I super appreciate all of the really wonderful questions that have come in.
Agreed. Thank you all for all the amazing questions and just taking time out to do this. And again, another shameless plug, go sign up for FOIs if you haven't already. They are all amazing. Great way to spend an hour and a half of your days a couple times a month, maybe.
And can students sign up for those too?
We are not open to students right now, but we are open to student employees. So anyone watching, folks in different departments and whatnot, please tell your student employees they are more than welcome to engage.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks to Laurie and to KayKay. Round of applause. We're all clapping. 77, I think, are watching right now. So thanks so much. We appreciate your time and your expertise, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Thank you. Thanks to Laurie.